This is the story of Brandon Cole and his wife Jessica Cole. On April 1st, Brandon sat in his car outside his own home, staring at a text message that simply read, "I need space to find myself again." According to him, the words didn't feel like a bomb dropping. They felt like the slow deflation of a tire he'd been ignoring for 3 years. Here's how he told it, sharing a quiet, almost detached recollection of a marriage that didn't explode, but rather dissolved under the weight of unspoken resentments and calculated choices. This is what he shared about the week everything changed. A narrative marked by a cold, precise clarity rather than the chaotic fury one might expect from a man watching his life get dismantled. I'll try to explain it the way I remember. This is how it happened. The small silver key to the filing cabinet in the den had always lived in the back of the ceramic bowl on the entryway table, buried beneath loose change, expired coupons, and dried flower petals from a bouquet I bought her for our 5th anniversary. I remember looking at that key on a Tuesday evening in late September, listening to the rhythmic, heavy thump of the washing machine downstairs. Jessica wasn't home. She had taken to spending her Tuesdays at a boutique marketing seminar downtown, a class she said was essential if she was ever going to expand her consulting firm beyond local clients. House felt abnormally large when she wasn't in it, the silence settling into the corners of the living room like dust. Our marriage hadn't become a battleground. It had become an estate of mutual tolerance. We moved around each other with the practiced grace of two strangers sharing a narrow hallway, shifting our shoulders to avoid brushing fabric. When she did come home, usually past 9, she smelled of expensive espresso and the crisp ozone scent of the autumn air, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen of her phone as she kicked off her heels. There was no greeting, no inquiry into my day, just a brief administrative nod that acknowledged my existence as the co-occupant of the space. I had grown accustomed to the quiet. In fact, I had begun to cultivate it, finding a strange, numbing comfort in the predictability of her absence. The underlying tension between us wasn't born from a single catastrophic event, but from a thousands-a-day accumulation of minor withdrawals. I had spent the last decade building a career as a senior forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm, a job that trained my brain to look for discrepancies, for the small numbers that didn't quite balance against the ledger. I carried that habit home, measuring the decreasing frequency of her smiles, the subtle shifts in her posture when I entered a room, the way her voice flattened whenever I asked about her business expenses. She was an ambitious woman, sharp-edged and fiercely protective of her independence, a trait I had initially admired but now found myself excluded from. My steady, methodical nature, once her anchor, had evidently become her cage. We had stopped sleeping in the same rhythm months ago. She would stay up late in the home office, the muffled clicking of her keyboard, a steady metronome that kept me awake in the dark bedroom. When I asked her about it once, she remarked, "Some of us are trying to build something real, Brandon, instead of just tracking other people's money." The comment wasn't delivered with heat. It was stated as a matter-of-fact observation, which made it cut deeper. It was her ego speaking, a quiet conviction that her time and her pursuits possessed a fundamental significance that mine lacked. I didn't argue. I simply turned over and looked at the digital clock, watching the minutes click over in silence. The secondary character in our domestic landscape arrived not as a sudden intruder, but as a frequent name in our casual conversations, Evan Parker. He was a junior partner at a real estate development firm that Jessica's consulting agency had recently signed. At first, he was just the client with the difficult portfolio. Then he became Evan thinks we should rebrand the entire campaign. And finally, he was just Evan. I met him once at a charity gala Jessica organized. He was younger than me by 4 years. With the easy, unearned confidence of a man who had never had to balance a ledger in his life, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that lacked the stiffness of off-the-rack formal wear. During that gala, I watched Jessica talk to him. It wasn't a display of overt flirtation. It was something far more damaging to look at. She was listening to him with an intensity she hadn't granted me in 5 years. Her chin tilted slightly upward, her laugh free and unburdened. When I approached them with 2 glasses of white wine, Evan smiled, a polite, entirely superficial gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Brandon, right? Jessica talks about your analytical mind all the time. Says you can spot a missing decimal from a mile away." It felt like a compliment wrapped in a patronizing slight, an acknowledgement that I was the utility man in her life, while he was the partner in her ambition. That night, in the car on the way home, the silence between us was thicker than usual. I looked at her profile in the dim green glow of the dashboard lights, her fingers tapping a restless rhythm against her leather purse. "Evan seems very invested in your firm's direction," I said, keeping my voice level, completely devoid of accusation. She didn't look at me. He understands where the market is going, Brandon. He doesn't just look at what's already happened. He looks at what could be. The subtext was clear. I was the past. He was the potential. A quiet, heavy discomfort settled in my chest, a physical weight that made it difficult to draw a full breath. I didn't press further because I was afraid of what she might say, and more importantly, I was afraid of my own lack of anger. I wasn't furious. I was analytical. My mind was already beginning to treat our marriage like a troubled corporate account, looking for the exact point where the liabilities began to outweigh the assets. By November, the emotional drift had widened into a chasm that no amount of polite dinner conversation could bridge. Jessica had filed for divorce. She did it cleanly through a private process server who delivered the paperwork to my office on a Thursday afternoon. The document was precise, requesting an equitable distribution of our marital assets but explicitly preserving her business entity and its associated accounts. When I called her, she answered on the second ring, her voice calm, professional, and entirely free of malice. "It's just time, Brandon," she said, the background noise of a busy restaurant humming through the line. "We've been dead for years. Let's just be adults about this and not turn it into a circus." I stood by my office window, looking down at the gray streets of the city. "You've already hired a lawyer." "Of course I have. And you should too. I'm going to take a couple of weeks to clear my head. I've earned a break." She didn't mention that her break involved a trip to a luxury resort in St. Lucia, nor did she mention that Evan Parker's social media accounts showed him checking into the exact same resort 48 hours later. She didn't need to. In the digital age, discretion is an act of deliberate effort, and Jessica had stopped putting effort into hiding anything from me. She posted photos of the beach, of 2 tropical drinks resting on a teak table with the turquoise ocean stretching out behind them, the caption reading, "The start of a beautiful new chapter." Her friends left comments filled with emojis of hearts and wine glasses, celebrating her liberation. I sat in our empty house, the legal documents spread across the dining room table, the silence now absolute. I opened my laptop and pulled up the joint bank accounts we still shared, along with the historical records of her business accounts that I had helped set up 3 years ago. As a forensic accountant, I knew that emotional validation was a phantom. Financial reality, however, was concrete. I began to look through the digital ledger of her firm, matching dates, invoices, and expense reports against her travel schedule over the past 9 months. It didn't take long to find the hairline cracks. There were several large consulting retainers paid to her firm by Evan's real estate company, followed almost immediately by identical transfers from her business account into a private LLC registered under a shell name in Delaware. When I cross-referenced the Delaware entity, I found the registered agent was Jessica's cousin. It was a classic, albeit clumsy, siphoning operation, moving marital funds and corporate revenue into an undisclosed account before the divorce papers were filed, effectively lowering her apparent net worth and the valuation of her business to reduce my potential settlement. I spent 3 days in that room, the light shifting from morning gold to gray twilight, surrounded by spreadsheets. I felt an internal conflict that wasn't rooted in grief, but in a strange sort of professional disappointment. She had thought so little of my intelligence that she executed a standard asset-hiding scheme right under the nose of a professional auditor. Her ego had blinded her to the very skill set that had provided our lifestyle. I wasn't angry about the affair. The affair was just a symptom of her desire for a different life. But the fraud, the deliberate attempt to shortchange our shared history through illegal financial engineering, that was an intellectual challenge I couldn't ignore. I remember stopping for a moment, staring at the blue light of the monitor, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something. The thought passed through my mind like a stray piece of static, an odd, disconnected fragment of the modern world invading my insular reality, before I shook my head and returned to the numbers. The deeper I dug, the more intricate the web became. Evan hadn't just been her lover, he had been her co-conspirator. The funds moving through the Delaware LLC were being used to secure a down payment on a commercial property in his firm's latest development project, a property that was slated to be Jessica's new flagship office once the divorce was finalized. They were building their future using the money that belonged, legally and morally, to the marriage she was trying to discard. I called my attorney, an old college friend named Marcus who specialized in high-net-worth divorces. When I explained what I had found, his voice over the phone dropped an octave. "Brandon, if you have the digital trail for this, it's not just a matter of marital asset division anymore. This is corporate fraud and tax evasion. They used interstate wires for those transfers. I have the trail, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any triumphant energy. I have every single transaction ID. You want to do? Marcus asked. I looked out the window at the dead leaves twisting across the lawn. Nothing yet. Let them enjoy their vacation. The confrontation didn't happen in a lawyer's office, nor did it involve shouted accusations across a mahogany table. It happened 3 days after Jessica returned from St. Lucia. She came to the house to pick up the remainder of her clothes, accompanied by Evan, who stood by the front door with his hands pocketed in his tailored slacks, looking like an awkward bodyguard ensuring a peaceful eviction. Jessica looked tan, healthy, her hair lighter from the Caribbean sun. She walked past me into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood, and set a cardboard box on the counter. The house looks clean, she said, her tone light, almost conversational. I appreciate you not making this difficult, Brandon. The numbers are always clean, Jessica, I replied, leaning against the doorframe, my arms crossed. She sighed, a small, patronizing sound. Look, I know you're hurt. I know the photos online might have felt insensitive, but I couldn't keep living a lie just to protect your comfort. Evan and I have a real partnership. We build things together. Evan cleared his throat from the hallway, stepping forward slightly. We just want to make sure everything is handled fairly, Brandon. No need for hard feelings. I looked at him, studying the slight tremor in his hand that he was trying to hide by adjusting his watch. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was an ambitious young executive who had found a woman willing to compromise her ethics for him. Fairly is a flexible word, I said. For instance, I think it's fair that we discuss the Delaware LLC, the one registered under your cousin's maiden name, Jessica. The kitchen became very quiet. The sound of the refrigerator hum filled the space between us. Jessica's hand stopped on the edge of the cardboard box, her knuckles turning slightly white. She didn't look at Evan, and Evan didn't look at her. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice dropping into a lower register, the warmth completely drained from it. That's a business matter that has nothing to do with you. It has to do with me when $350,000 of marital income was routed through it over the last 8 months. I said, my voice remaining perfectly level, conversational. And it certainly has to do with the federal authorities when those funds were used to purchase commercial real estate under false pretenses, while filing an affidavit of limited assets in a state divorce court. Evan stepped into the kitchen fully now, his easy demeanor replaced by a rigid defensive posture. Listen here, Cole. If you think you can threaten us with some accounting nonsense because your feelings are hurt, I'm not talking to you, Evan, I said, turning my gaze directly to Jessica. Your lawyer received a packet this morning. It contains the forensic audit I performed, along with a copy of the disclosure forms I've prepared for the IRS and the state attorney's office. I haven't filed them yet. I wanted to see you first. Jessica stared at me, her eyes wide, her breath short. For the first time in our relationship, her ego wasn't serving as a shield. It was the very thing that had trapped her. You would ruin my business? For revenge? No, I said, shaking my head. For balance. You told me I only look at what's already happened. You were right. I looked at what you did, and now I'm balancing the ledger. If we go to court under your current filing, those documents go to the state. If you sign the amended agreement my lawyer drafted, the one where you forfeit your claim to the house, the joint investments, and pay a lump sum equalization from your private holdings, then the Delaware accounts remain a civil matter between us. That would destroy everything we've put together for the new firm, Evan said, his voice rising, a note of panic breaking through his polished exterior. He looked at Jessica, his confidence evaporating. Jessica, you said he wouldn't look at those accounts. You said he just handled the household bills. Jessica didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on me, her expression a mix of calculation and a creeping heavy realization that she had completely misjudged the man she had lived with for 10 years. You're cold, Brandon. You always have been. I'm accurate, I said. You have 24 hours to sign the amended settlement. She didn't take her clothes. She picked up her designer purse, turned on her heel, and walked out the front door, her movements fast, almost frantic. Evan lingered for a fraction of a second, looking at me with a mixture of anger and genuine fear, before following her out into the crisp afternoon air. The front door clicked shut, the sound final and neat. 6 months later, the world had rearranged itself into a quieter, more predictable shape. The divorce had been finalized without a single day spent in a courtroom. Jessica had signed the amended agreement within 18 hours of our kitchen conversation, her attorney recognizing that a prolonged discovery process would inevitably expose the criminal nature of her financial maneuvers. I stayed in the house. The space no longer felt empty. It felt unburdened. I spent my evenings reading in the den, the ceramic bowl on the entryway table now holding only my keys and loose change, the dried petals long since thrown in the trash. I didn't feel a sense of triumph when I looked at my updated financial statements. I felt a sense of order. The assets were mine. The liabilities had been removed. Through mutual acquaintances and public records, the aftermath of their choices came clear. The financial strain of the settlement, combined with the sudden withdrawal of Evan's firm from their commercial real estate venture to protect their own reputation, had broken Jessica's business. She had been forced to downsize her agency, moving out of her downtown office into a small shared workspace on the outskirts of the city. Her social media accounts, once a curated exhibition of luxury and new beginnings, had gone dark. Evan hadn't stayed. In the corporate world, ambition is a predatory thing. Once Jessica's financial viability was compromised, his interest in their partnership faded. He had been transferred to a different branch of his firm in another state, a lateral move that served as a polite exile from the local real estate community. There was no grand explosion, no cinematic moment of ruin for them, just the slow, grinding consequence of an overextended ego. I ran into Jessica once in early April at a grocery store near our old neighborhood. She looked different without the high-end styling and the armor of her professional persona. Her hair was tied back in a simple clip, her face pale under the fluorescent lights, her cart containing basic, unpretentious items. When she saw me, she stopped, her hand tightening on the handle of her cart. I nodded to her, a polite, neutral gesture. "Hello, Jessica." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes scanning my face as if searching for a trace of the man she used to ignore. "You look well, Brandon," she said, her voice quiet, lacking the sharp edge it used to carry. "I am," I said. "I used to think you were just boring," she said, a small, sad smile touching the corners of her mouth. It wasn't an insult, it was a confession. "I thought because you didn't talk about big plans, you didn't have any depth." I replayed that day in the kitchen 100 times. I realized I never actually looked at you. "Most people don't look at the foundation until the roof starts to leak," I said, keeping my tone mild. She nodded slowly, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "We're selling the property downtown, or rather the bank is. Evan left in January." "I know," I said. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, perhaps to apologize, or perhaps to ask for something, but the words didn't come. The silence between us returned, but it wasn't the heavy, resentful silence of our marriage. It was the vast, empty silence of two people who had completely finished their conversation. She moved her cart past me, her coat brushing against mine for a brief, fleeting second, before she disappeared down the aisle. The final papers from the title company arrived in a crisp, white envelope on a rainy Friday in mid-May. The house was officially listed for sale. I had decided that while the space was ordered, it was also old, and I wanted a place that didn't have the ghost of a 15-year ledger attached to it. I sat on the covered back porch, watching the rain bounce off the stone pavers, a mug of black coffee cooling in my hands. The divorce hadn't been a tragedy of love lost. It had been a comedy of miscalculated leverage. Jessica had wanted validation, a sense of importance that she believed could only be found in the reflection of another person's ambition. I had wanted stability, a quiet perimeter where the numbers matched and the expectations were clear. In the end, we both got exactly what we were willing to pay for. My phone buzzed on the glass table next to me. It was an email from Marcus, confirming that the last of the escrow funds had been cleared and deposited into my private account. The transaction was complete. The account was closed. I thought about Jessica's comment in the grocery store, that she had never actually looked at me. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me in our entire marriage. Her flaw wasn't her desire for more. Her flaw was her belief that everyone else was stationary while she was the only one moving forward. She had viewed my predictability as a weakness, a common error made by people who confuse momentum with progress. The rain began to slacken, the heavy drops turning into a fine gray mist that hung over the lawn. I stood up, walked back inside, and closed the sliding glass door behind me. The house was quiet, clean, and ready for the next occupants. I picked up my briefcase, checked that the lights were off, and walked out the front door, locking it behind me one final time. I placed the small silver key on the counter for the real estate agent, walked down the driveway to my car, and drove away into the quiet gray afternoon, leaving the ledger completely balanced behind me.